Hello, welcome to our presentation about learning outcomes at Edson College of Nursing and Health Innovation at ASU. We're honored to have many expert nurses on our faculty. Often though, new nurse educators aren't familiar with educational terms like learning outcomes. We hope to change that today by introducing some basics about how to write, manage, and implement student learning outcomes for our nursing students here at Edson. Our learning outcomes here are to define and differentiate program, course, and module or weekly level student learning outcomes. We'll review the 3 different learning domains and talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and we'll also use Bloom's taxonomy to create some learning outcomes. So what are learning outcomes exactly? Mary McDonald, a renowned nurse educator, defines learning outcomes this way. Learning outcomes indicate behaviors that an instructor is willing to accept as evidence that the student has achieved the general objective. She states that learning outcomes should be student-focused and should include an action verb. Learning outcomes give students structured expectations, and they help faculty guide learning. When we met in person to learn about learning outcomes, we took part in a discussion about why program level outcomes are important. Some of the participants stated that program level outcomes helped our college match what the State Board of Nursing required or what was expected on the NCLEX. Program level outcomes also help us meet national standards. Another important point is that our program level outcomes guide our development of the other student learning outcomes we devise for our courses and our weekly class lectures. These are essentially the cornerstone of our entire curriculum. So here are our 10 Edson College program level outcomes. These can be found in the student handbook or the faculty handbook. You can locate these handbooks by visiting the pre-licensure faculty resources page. So these 10 outcomes are based on the 5 patterns of knowing. The first 4 patterns of knowing were conceived by Carper in 1978, and these are ethics, personal knowing, aesthetics, and empirics. The 5th pattern of knowing was developed by Chin and Kramer in 2008, and it's called emancipatory knowing, and that refers to the social, political, critical reflection, and action aspects of nursing and nursing education. So pause the video here if you wish and read through our Edson program level learning outcomes. The second level of learning outcomes are course level learning outcomes. If you look on the first or second page of any Edson course syllabus, you'll find the course level learning outcomes. As you can see by the red stop sign, these outcomes are essentially set in stone. Keeping these outcomes the same from semester to semester prevents what we call curriculum drift, and it provides stability for the structure of our curriculum. If a change is needed in the course outcome, we can facilitate this by bringing it to the undergraduate curriculum committee, but it's a complex process. In other words, a single instructor should not change course outcomes. The course level learning outcomes are built using the Lassiter tool. This is also used in the clinical courses. It's based on Tanner's clinical judgment model. So you can see here the 3 headings of critical thinker, evidence-based practitioner, and innovative professional are weaved into many of our course level learning outcomes. So our final level is the module level learning outcomes. And these are the next level of learning outcomes that we as faculty work with most directly. They look like this in the Edson Canvas course. These are the specific details you are teaching in a single lecture or class session. Individual instructors can change these, but remember that they need to correspond to at least one of the course learning outcomes. So that's where it helps to map out the different levels of learning outcomes in a course, to verify that you're covering the goals you want to meet for your students, and also to make sure that you're not including extraneous information that you don't really need to be teaching. So in summary, our program level outcomes are the overarching big outcomes that we want our graduate nursing students to obtain. Our course learning outcomes are set for each course, and we use these to guide our module level or weekly learning outcomes. You can scan this QR code for our handout, which includes detailed information about leveling and lots of examples of verbs in the next 3 slides. When nurse educators talk about learning outcomes, we usually reference Bloom's cognitive levels. Benjamin Bloom created a taxonomy of measurable verbs to help us describe and classify observable knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, and abilities. The theory is based upon the idea that there are levels of observable actions that indicate something is happening in the brain. In other words, cognitive activity. By creating learning outcomes using measurable verbs, you indicate explicitly what the student must do in order to demonstrate learning. We can also use these learning outcomes to evaluate whether or not the outcomes have been achieved. Bloom mainly focused on cognitive levels, but we know that nursing also involves affective and psychomotor skills. Crothwell, Bloom, and Masia in 1964 developed levels of affective learning outcomes related to feelings and emotions. In other words, therapeutic communication. Dave in 1970 developed levels of psychomotor skills. We can identify which domain is the most pertinent when writing learning outcomes for our students by reviewing these different sets of action verbs. This slide builds on the previous slide by providing more detail about the different levels of cognitive, affective, and psychomotor verbs. Another way to think about this template for learning outcomes is to remember the acronym ASK, which stands for Attitude, Skills, and Knowledge. All 3 domains are important building blocks in nursing education. In our live group session, each participant received a prompt from the previous slide. These are also in your handout, available through the QR code here. If we consider the nursing care example of assessing a patient for pain, drawing up and administering IV morphine, could you write a learning outcome on different levels for the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills that a student would need? Pause the video, pick a few examples, and use the example verbs in the handout to create 1 or 2 learning objectives for the example of assessing a patient for pain, drawing up, and administering morphine. So to summarize, we have different levels of learning outcomes at Edson. Ideally, each level builds on the higher level of outcomes. An individual instructor cannot change program level or course level learning outcomes, but weekly or module level learning outcomes may be thoughtfully and carefully changed. Bloom's is a great resource for writing learning outcomes, and we need to consider all the realms of learning our students need: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today. How will you apply this in your work with students? What else are you curious about now that we've introduced the basics of learning outcomes? Send your questions or comments to the email on your screen, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.